Morning, everyone. I'm Jim Santilli. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Transportation Improvement Association. I just want to thank you all for joining us this morning. Again, this is going to be a virtual training on electric vehicles, looking at EVs from a public safety perspective. We have two phenomenal speakers this morning. We have Dr. Thomas Barth, who's the Chief of the Special Investigations Branch of the Office of Highway Safety at the National Transportation Safety Board, also known as NTSB. And then we have Chief Stephen Gollan from the Fort Lauderdale Fire Department. So thank you both for being here this morning, and thank you to everybody for joining us. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Tom Barth. Thank you, Dr. Barth. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I will be talking about the hazards associated with high voltage lithium-ion battery fires based on our investigations we've done over the last several years. I got to share my screen here. Okay, is everybody able to see that presentation?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now if it'll forward. Well. There, okay. So first I'll cover a quick background of how lithium-ion battery issues came to our attention. Then I'll cover, we issued a report back in 2020 that was based on several investigations we did with battery fires in electric vehicles. I'll cover that, the safety issues that we found from those investigations and our findings and recommendations. And then I'll go into our more current work on EV fire investigations, make some observations about all of this, and then provide some resources. And at the end of the presentation, I'll provide a PDF that can be distributed to the audience so that you can, because some of the stuff I'm going to gloss over, I'm not going to go in every bullet point on the slide, but you'll have access to those so that you can read the details later. First, the NTSB is an independent federal agency. We're not part of the Department of Transportation. We conduct investigations in all modes of travel. We're probably most well known for our aviation investigations. We have divisions that look at obviously aviation, marine, railroad, pipeline, hazardous materials, and of course highway safety, which is the office that I work in. So we started looking at lithium-ion batteries back, the Chevy Volt incident, some of you may recall back in 2011. It was a crash test that was being done on a new vehicle. It damaged the battery, and then the vehicle caught fire 3 weeks later while it was sitting at a test track waiting for to be auctioned off for salvage. And so that raised a lot of people's awareness that these batteries, some unexpected things can happen. So we started monitoring what was happening with this emerging technology at that point. Around 2012, there were some electric vehicle fires from Teslas, things like Teslas running over a trailer hitch in the highway. But they were pretty routine. They didn't pose real significant challenges. Tesla addressed some of that work by changing the design to help beef up the battery for those types of incidents. And then around 2013, there were some lithium-ion battery fires in aircraft, and these were the NTSB conducted investigations of these and some pretty significant studies looking at how to mitigate the risks of lithium-ion batteries. And we had recommendations that came out of those series of investigations for the aircraft. And then for a few years, we really didn't see much that raised our concern until around 2017, when we started to see some electric vehicle fires that were creating challenges to first responders. And so we conducted a series of investigations to look at that, and I'll go into a little more detail about those now. The first one was in Lake Forest, California in 2017. The bullets here give kind of a detail of what happened in the crash. I'm not going to go through that, but essentially what you see is that the vehicle was going down a residential street. You see the orange arrows there. It departed the roadway to the right, hit a concrete drainage culvert where you see the red arrow on the photo on the upper right. That when it went through that culvert, that the front end impacted that culvert and it ruptured the battery pack, which was started the fire in that battery pack. The vehicle traveled across the roadway and into that red circle area, which was the house that caught fire. So here's a photo of that house, and while it's on fire, you can see the white Tesla there in the garage area with some fire around the front right and lower portion. Yeah, so the firefighters were a little confused because the fire in the house kept reigniting, and it wasn't until they pulled the vehicle out of the garage that they realized that it was the batteries on the vehicle actually reigniting through thermal runaway that kept feeding the structure fire. And so this was a new phenomena for these firefighters to deal with. It took them quite a while to get that car put out. They were learning about how to put water on it, how much water to put on it. One of the things they realized was that if they crib the vehicle up and apply water directly underneath where the battery was on this vehicle to cool it down to stop that thermal runaway was one of the key elements. And you see there the photo on the left, it's now dark. This is several hours later as they're dealing with this event. And then the vehicle seemed to be all good. Fire was out. They loaded it onto a flatbed, and you see the photo on the right is a flatbed tow truck where when they moved the vehicle, it started to ignite again and catch fire. And so this is them trying to load it off of that flatbed. And one of the mechanisms of reigniting is if you have damaged battery cells and you shift them around, you can create short circuits in the battery that will go into thermal runaway. So those were the challenges in that case. The next one we looked at was in Mountain View, California, in March of 2018. This was a crash that it received quite a bit of publicity. The vehicle was operating on autopilot mode, and I'll explain how that happened really quickly. But again, the battery pack got ruptured when it struck the crash attenuator in the median and caught fire. Now in this case, and this is quite often even with a fairly severe crash where the batteries catch fire, there was a period of minutes for the fire to develop. And so bystanders actually approached the vehicle and pulled the driver out of the vehicle prior to the fire really catching on. Unfortunately, the driver was fatally injured in this crash. But that's a fairly common indication with these electric vehicles that they don't just burst into flames right away. It often takes some time to develop. Just real quick on how this crash occurred. So it's an optical system. The car on the right, and the track follows the vehicle tracks the left lane line, and as it approached this HOV lane to the left, it mistook the left lane line. It mistook this upper yellow line for the left lane line, and so it directed the vehicle directly into that crash attenuator. Now, there's an entire NTSB report that deals just with all that autonomous vehicle or advanced driver assistance systems, if you're interested in those. But we were looking at the electric vehicle fire aspects of this crash for this investigation. The vehicle was relocated to a tow yard, and we were out there investigating it. We were working with the California Highway Patrol on removing the airbag module from the car, and This, again, when you do that, you shift around wreckage. We didn't notice anything at the time, but later on that night, you see the photo on the right is a fire truck. This is from a security camera. In the middle of the night, the vehicle reignited. When we had moved around that wreckage a little bit to pull the airbag module out, it actually created some short circuits that weren't apparent at the time, but then it developed into a thermal runaway later on in the evening. So it obviously highlights, some of the concerns about making sure that the vehicles are isolated and be aware of the potential for reignition. And there's the stranded energy in these vehicles that remains, the energy in the battery pack after the crash. We picked up another crash in Fort Lauderdale, and obviously we have the chief here for that one. This was an extremely high-speed crash with 116 miles an hour impacting a wall. And this one was a little unique in that it was such a high-speed crash that it immediately it ruptured the battery pack, but to a large degree, even with sections of the battery being pulled out of the pack. And so it did catch fire very rapidly because of the level of damage. We did see kind of similar things though with this crash where there were reignitions. When they were recovering the wreckage from the scene, it actually separated the battery pack from the vehicle. Which you see there on the left is the battery pack with the top cover taken off. Because that battery pack completely separated from the vehicle, it allowed us to do a little bit deeper level inspection and confirm the stranded energy and understand what some of the voltages were within the battery pack. And so this crash again helped us understand what's happening with these cases. It introduced some new concerns about storage of the wreckage. You see the photo on the bottom right with the battery pack. They stacked along, that's like a door and the electric motor and some other parts. It's not the best way to store this because there's still energy in this battery pack that could reignite. And so as we're going through these cases and learning about what's happening with this, we picked up one more case in West Hollywood, California. Now, this one was quite different. It was not a crash. The battery pack was not ruptured. It was an internal failure of the battery pack. The motorist was driving down the road. Some people flagged him down for smoke. He pulled over to the side of the road. He had time to get his belongings out of the vehicle. And then the smoke and fire developed in the vehicle, where you see there in the photograph. As the firefighters were arriving, visible flames started coming out, and you can see the little circles there are when these batteries go into thermal runaway. There's like a pretty forceful venting that can occur, and it can eject either debris or cells. So it can be, it's producing a fair amount of flammable gas. This one also had some similar, even though it was not as severe of an event as the other ones we looked at, there were some of the similar issues with the fire responders having difficulty. Like, for example, you see on the photo on the right, they've already put out the fire. You can see that they've used some foam and they've extinguished the regular vehicle fire, but there's still some smoke coming up from the battery. And so the firefighters were a little confused about, okay, we still see smoke. That means we've got fire. We need to keep extinguishing this, but where do we apply this water? When do we stop putting water on it? What are the criteria for us to make decisions on how to treat this vehicle? So we gathered up these cases, and we really came up with two basic safety issues that we found. One of them was inadequacy of the emergency response guides. They just didn't provide the detailed information to the responder community on how to deal with these some of these specific events, specifically firefighting and how to mitigate the stranded energy aspects. The other, that was the other finding, was that gaps in regulatory safety standards for these high-speed, high-severity crashes. And even in anytime you have a thermal runaway where you have stranded energy, the regulations are mostly focused on preventing thermal runaway from occurring in the first place. And there's some gaps where if you have a high-speed crash or you do have a thermal runaway occur, and you look at it from that standpoint, then what do you do, assuming that you did have a thermal runaway, rather than trying to prevent that from happening? And so we made some recommendations to address those areas, which I'll just talk about in a second here. On the photographs, this is an electric vehicle fire incident in Europe, where in Europe they have a different system with the fire trucks with a modular. They have the basic truck with a modular back, and so it's a little easier for them in a lot of cases to bring like a big tank out. And so one of the things that they've looked at doing is submerging vehicles into large tanks, which raises a whole nother, there's a lot of discussion right now about the best way to approach these incidents. The graphic here is the standardized sections of the ISO standard for emergency response guides, which I'll talk about in a second. So the recommendations we made we made 2 recommendations to NHTSA, that's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, that's the DOT federal agency that governs the regulations on highway vehicles. And we asked them to incorporate the emergency response guides into the new car assessment program to help give an incentive to the manufacturers to really produce good emergency response guides. That recommendation has not been adopted this time. And the other recommendation we made was to expand the research specifically that we saw in these crashes. And there has been some movement on that. There's a lot of efforts right now and a lot of new funding to both look at ways of mitigating stranded energy and also revamping some of the training, things like that. And I'll discuss a little bit or provide some resources of that training at the end. The biggest recommendation we made was to all the electric vehicle manufacturers that had cars, trucks, or buses in the field at the time of the report being released, and we wanted them to adopt the standard formatting of that ISO standard. And so, no matter who responder you are, where you're at, you always have the emergency response guide. You always know where to look. Like for the example on the photo on the right, if no matter what vehicle you have, if you have a bus and you want to know where the stored energy is on this bus, you always know to go to section 5, the yellow section 5, to see where those batteries are located, to have that standardization. And then the other thing we wanted was we did a detailed look at the emergency response guides across the industry, and we had specific findings about, we want them to provide specifically better information about exactly how to fight the fires, what kind of criteria to use for, like I said, making decisions about when you can stop applying water, how much water to apply, that kind of specific information for each vehicle, for those responders to know the best practice for that vehicle. And then there was another recommendation, we approached 7 different responders, first and secondary responder associations, basically just to get the word out on these issues. So now I'll kind of shift into some of our more current work. We've done a couple other high-speed crashes that involved electric vehicle fires. These cases weren't looking specifically at the fire, but they involved fire. And so those reports, I had listed the report numbers there. The dockets do provide some information about the firefighting and what happened with those vehicles. And then the other big area we're doing right now is we have 3 current investigations with battery electric transit bus fires. One in Indianapolis, one in Hampton, Connecticut, and one in Philly. And these buses were not in operation. They were stationary. 2 of them were charging and one of them was not. All 3 buses had had some sort of anomalies indicated, and the batteries caught fire, with a range of response for that. So with these, we're doing something similar to what we had done in the past, where we're gathering up these 3 investigations with some other side information, and we will produce an NTSB board level report that addresses our findings for these cases. So to make some observations, what I wanted to try to do was to say, you know, to anticipate questions that you guys might have. And so, you know, when you first arrive, especially, you know, like a lot of times you'll have bystanders or police officers who might be the first on scene. And so they're wondering, what do I do? You know, what do I need to pay attention to? One thing is to be aware of that, to avoid that smoke. It's toxic. And if you're the officers on scene, you need to be careful about where that smoke is going for yourselves and for bystanders. A lot of times bystanders will be concerned about electric shock, like, it's an electric vehicle. Do I have to worry about being shocked? Now, this obviously can have a range of, depending on what the wreckage is like, but all modern electric vehicles have pyrotechnic fuses, so that if the battery management system depicts a failure in the system, it will isolate the high voltage lines that are running out of the battery pack. It'll isolate the high voltage to within the pack. So we haven't seen problems with people approaching the vehicles from an electric shock perspective. Although there's still obviously risks there with the batteries venting, and also, I mean, depending on the wreckage, you can never say for certain. There are high voltage systems in that, but generally those fuses have been working well to isolate the. We have not seen a lot of cases where the high voltage remained in the high voltage lines or to the electric motor post event. From a firefighting perspective, one of the main things obviously is wear your SCBA. Cover your skin, think about those bystanders. And the main thing is, you got to get those batteries cooled down. I mentioned before about thermal runaway and how essentially what's happening is there's a plastic separator between the cathode and the anode in each of the battery cells. And if you have a short circuit in a battery cell, either from mechanical deformation from the crash or from a failure, internal failure of the battery, that anytime you short circuit a battery, it'll start generating heat. If it reaches the temperature where it melts that plastic separator, that cell will go into thermal runaway. That heat will then start transferring to the next cell, and then that module could go into thermal runaway to the next one, and you can have a chain reaction happening, which is the phenomena of this thermal runaway event. Now there are obviously methods that the manufacturers do to try to isolate these cells and modules to try to stop that from happening. And so there's a variety of reactions that can occur depending on the design. But that's essentially what's happening, is that the heat is causing the neighboring cell or module to reignite once that heat dissipates into it and melts that separator. And so the way to stop that from happening is to get those cells cooled down. The plastic has if you cool it down below the boiling temperature of water, then those plastic separators are no longer melting, and the thermal runaway should come to a stop. Things like thermal cameras are a really good method to deal with that, to note whether or not you're cool enough. There was questions about, several years ago, there were a lot of questions about electrical shock at the nozzle of the, because water obviously is conductive. And so there were some studies done, and we have not seen any cases of electric current traveling up through the water stream. It just hasn't been an issue. There's some theories about why that's the case, but that has not been an issue for the firefighters. And the next thing is, watch for high voltage lines in the vehicle. I'd like to see some better standardization with the coloring and things. Mostly they're either the high voltage lines are either wrapped in bright yellow or orange. But you have to be aware of if that battery pack is ruptured or there's damage to make sure you're not, you have to be careful of high voltage systems. The ERG is, as we've stressed with the recommendations, that's going to be your best source of information to address that, to find out what exactly to do with this particular vehicle. The other thing we've been seeing lately, and I'll provide some examples, is that the venting gas from these batteries is flammable, and if it's being vented into an enclosed space, it can explode. And so I'll cover a couple examples of that. And then the other issue is after the event, after the fire has been extinguished, that stranded energy, movement of the vehicle can cause reignitions. And then also we've seen some instances where in less severe crashes where, electric vehicle, if it still has power going to the drivetrain, you need to chalk the wheels and block the vehicle so that if power does go to the drivetrain, it doesn't move the vehicle and cause an injury from that respect. And then later on down in the line, isolating that vehicle. We've started to see tow yards do things like put cinder block bays in so that they can isolate electric vehicles with damaged batteries. And then eventually what they'll have to do is, get that battery separated from the vehicle and then treat that battery appropriately. So I'll have a couple of examples. One thing I'll just mention real quick, the hurricanes, back in 2012 in Sandy, there were 338 Fisker Karmas that were flooded, and 16 of them caught fire. And actually the investigation found that it was shorting a 12-volt system that caused that. But then once you get the vehicle on fire, it can catch the neighboring vehicle on fire. And so there's a full NTSB report that investigated that whole thing and explains what happened there. And then with the Hurricane Ian in 2022, we saw a series of vehicles catching fire after the flood. There were about 3,000 to 5,000 EVs that were water damaged. About 600 were identified as a total loss. And of all of those, there's 21 noted instances where the vehicle caught fire after water exposure. So, that we're right now, NTSB is conducting a study to try to understand what are the actual, what actually happened here. Why did those 21 out of, depending on how you look at it, they're still trying to understand exactly how many were completely flooded, what levels they were flooded, what state of charge those vehicles had, the different factors. The salinity of the water can be a factor, because we didn't see, interestingly, the floods that happened in California recently, we didn't see the same reporting of EVs catching fire after the water exposure. So NTSB is conducting a study now to try to understand exactly what the factors around that. So I mentioned about the batteries venting into an enclosed space. There was a FedEx truck that was hauling 2 Lucid vehicle batteries, and the driver was driving down the road. He heard a big pop. He wasn't sure what it was. It turned out that there was an explosion that blew the back door off of his FedEx truck, and that's under investigation right now, and trying to understand what happened there. It did catch fire. You see the photo on the right, but those venting gases into an enclosed space, once they reach the right air-fuel ratio, can explode. Another example of that was in Birmingham, Alabama, just in March here of 2023. And this one, that looks like a flatbed trailer. It was an enclosed trailer. These were consumer electronics batteries, a bunch of tool batteries and consumer electronics that they were improperly packaged into drums, going off to a recycler, and they one of the drums started releasing, the batteries went into thermal runaway. Again, there was like a slow development of gas, and then that one resulted in quite a big explosion. You see the this photograph doesn't show it as well as some others, but the Boeing, it actually bent the frame of the trailer and blew up that trailer. And so we actually have like a group of people right now trying to secure some funding to do some modeling and a study to understand exactly the dynamics of what happened in that case. And then you may have also heard about, there's been a couple of other instances. There was like where there's been some vehicles that were charging, outgassing, and you can have like a garage explode. So you have to, if you think there's venting lithium ion batteries in an enclosed space, be aware of that potential. And then I had one that's like a little bit of a success story anyway. This one was a semi-truck that was hauling Chevy Bolt vehicle batteries that was involved in a collision that dumped the batteries out onto the highway, and there were some other secondary collisions that occurred. And this one was kind of a success story because although a couple battery packs did catch fire, it wasn't a large-scale event, and many of the battery packs never caught fire. And so again, this is being looked at to understand, what role did the packaging have to play, the proper packaging have in making this not develop into a larger event. So we get to the last slide here, some resources for you. I've split these up into sort of practical guidance, like what do you do? And probably the main source of this right now is the NFPA has a web page that's located there with the manufacturer emergency response guides. Now, at this point, unfortunately, this is like one of the guys at the NFPA has been working really diligently to reach out to the vehicle manufacturers and get them to provide them with the emergency response guide. It's not an official, but there are efforts to try to make this like emergency response guides, to try to make a one location national repository. Like in Europe, they have it where you're required to, by the government, all the vehicle manufacturers are required to provide a emergency response guide. There's a single location to access all those response guides. That doesn't happen. That doesn't exist yet in the United States, but there's some efforts to try to make that happen. But anyway, so right now, this NFPA website is one of the best places to access these emergency response guides. And then there are also, some private company, the normal place that you get your rescue sheets and extrication information also has a lot of this information. Another practical guide is there's a guide for dealing with damaged, defective, or recalled batteries through a PHMSA agency. And this is focused more on on dealing with the batteries themselves, like how to safely ship them or move them. So there's a guide there. And then there is a best practices for emergency response to incidents that is located at the address there. It was organized by the National Fire Protection Association and brought in. It was a good study that was done where they even did some actual fire testing to measure, how much water they needed to put out batteries and things like that. Unfortunately, it's 10 years old at this point, but it's still a useful piece of information. And hopefully we'll have, there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of funding right now to try to improve and find out new information and update that kind of information. And then, this was my last slide. This is just also some online training and things that the FSRI, the Underwriter Laboratory FSRI provides. So that provides some good resources for you guys. Yeah, and thank you very much. And sorry for the confusion with the system.
All new tonight, you see them more and more, hybrid and electric cars.
They say
Save drivers trips to the gas station, but when it comes to saving lives, they pose a unique risk for firefighters. It's tonight's 7 Investigates. Here's Brian Enton.
Can't get them out.
The video is tough to watch. Knowing 2 teens are inside this burning car, a Tesla on fire after slamming into a wall in Fort Lauderdale last month. The high school seniors, just weeks away from graduation, did not survive.
People were standing in the middle of the street screaming obscenities out of frustration that they couldn't get to the people in the car.
Days later, a team from the NTSB was sent to South Florida to investigate the electric car fire and the challenges faced by firefighters.
The electric cars in general are presenting new hazards to us. It's a rapid changing technology.
Fort Lauderdale Battalion Chief Stephen Gollan was the incident commander the evening of the crash. He can't talk specifics because of the federal investigation, but says when electric car batteries catch fire, they are difficult to put out.
It's been my experience that it is a much hotter fire. There's a lot more energy there.
The energy comes from the car's lithium-ion batteries. After the fires are extinguished, damaged batteries can reignite. That's what happened after the Fort Lauderdale crash and after this deadly California highway crash earlier this year. And if someone is trapped inside an electric car, firefighters have to be careful where they cut into the car. Parts may have electricity still flowing through them.
It could seriously injure the firefighter, whoever was cutting the cables.
Fort Lauderdale firefighters use iPads with diagrams of the different electric and hybrid cars on them. It shows them where they can safely cut to avoid electricity.
Everything we need to see based upon all angles of the vehicle.
And it's not just electric car fires South Florida firefighters have to train for. There are more electric and hybrid buses on the roads, and they have even bigger batteries.
This is the kill switch for the battery.
Okay.
If you were to shut it off, you simply move the lever down to the off position.
Firefighters throughout Miami-Dade train on the county's 137 hybrid buses. The batteries are on the roof, and these orange cables are all high voltage.
And God forbid you have a situation related to the engine. You don't want anybody inadvertently coming, not understanding what's going on, and cut the wrong cable.
Bottom line, electric vehicles are better for the environment, and there's no evidence they catch on fire more than gas-powered cars. But if they do, firefighters can find themselves in danger if they don't have the right training. Brian Enton, 7 News.
Okay, I'll now turn it over to Chief Steve Gollan, who's now the chief of the Fort Lauderdale Fire Department. So thanks, Chief, for joining us this morning. Great to see you.
So good morning. Thank you everyone for having me in this opportunity. I think clearly you've seen at this point that EV vehicles and lithium batteries are something that we could discuss for hours on end. The technology has changed, and you're now seeing it in all car manufacturers and across the board. It says that it's shared now. Jim, give me a hot shake of your head if you can see it.
Yes, we're seeing it now.
Yeah, I can
All right,
see it.
perfect. So, I think the importance at what the doctor shared with us and all the stuff that we're seeing is that if you haven't seen one of these fires in your community, it's just a matter of when. It's going to happen. I know we have a very, very diverse group here this morning, and to try and hit from a police and fire standpoint of view, this is a hazard, a ticking time bomb in most communities across the United States, with every car manufacturer now having lithium batteries in their cars and knowing where those batteries are and the potentials that may be there. When we look at some of the concerns that we have with these is obviously disabling the high voltage systems and the fires that the doctor discussed a little while ago with us. From a law enforcement standpoint of view, if you are in a high speed chase with one of these vehicles and it gets into an accident, disrupting those batteries, there is a very, very high probability that that vehicle is going to catch on fire. You will want to try and get the occupants of that vehicle out of the vehicle as soon as it is safe to do so, and isolate the vehicle if at all possible. Also make sure that you're getting fire rescue en route as soon as possible. From a fire rescue standpoint of view, Big water, big fire. This is something that isn't your normal car fire. Even for a municipality like ours here in Fort Lauderdale, where we have hydrants, every block, when the fire occurs on I-95 on the interstate, and we have limited access to water, we've got to get those trucks en route early. Having this vehicle fire on a major interstate and having the challenges that we see with it reigniting and continuing to burn can pretty much handcuff our mode of transportation by shutting down the interstate for hours because we can't effectively control the fire if we don't get a start on it from the very beginning. And that start means getting the right resources there, get them on the road, get them heading in that direction. It's far better to turn them around than to need them and not have them there. So remember, big water, you're going to need it. And disabling the high voltage system. That's one of the key things if it comes to a point where we have to start cutting the vehicle apart. When we're looking at the voltage system, remember that there's the high voltage system that is working somewhere around the 400 volt range. And then there's also a 12 volt system. So just because the fusion has taken place and the high voltage system has been completely cut off from the vehicle, there's still the potential for the 12 volt system to be operational in the vehicle. When you start to look at ERGs or NFPAs or a guide that I'll even share with you at the very end, there's points that firefighters can take to isolate the batteries. You'll see in the two pictures that I have here, one being a Tesla and the other one being a BMW, where the cut points are very, very well clearly identified. By cutting these cables at these points will isolate that high voltage system from the rest of the vehicle. This is just in case that the breaking point hasn't occurred and it hasn't self-isolated. Anytime that you're going to start cutting the car or making modifications to the car, ripping the car apart, anything like that, you're really going to want to go ahead and isolate this before you start your extrication process. One of the unique challenges to EV vehicles is that you're basically battling every class of fire that's out there. You have the Class A fire, Class B, Class C, and Class D. Those in the fire industry know that the Class Ds are always our most challenging to put out. These are the ones with the magnesium, the titanium, aluminum, and lithium, and these are the ones that respond to water. So when we start to put water on it, expect that violent explosion coming back at you and things like that. As mentioned multiple times during this presentation, big water, big fire, make sure that water is there early and that the cooling takes place. Some common risk for first responders associated with these electrical vehicles is the electrical shock. Now, the electrical shock is not going to be if you are flowing water on it, if you're touching the vehicle, anything like that. Where the risk of electrical shock comes from is cutting the vehicle in the wrong place. If you cut any of the orange cables that are in the vehicle, those are the high voltage cables running through the vehicle, and that's where you would have the potential to be shocked. Just normal extrication maneuvers, flowing water, any of that, you should not experience a shock. Extremely high temperatures and thermal runaways. Well, that was kind of goes back to where I said that if you are in a vehicle pursuit with one of these vehicles and you have it operating at a high rate of speed, and that vehicle comes to a sudden stop and is in an accident, rupturing the cases that the batteries are in, there is a very high potential for that vehicle to then experience a thermal runaway. Be cautious of that as your officers are approaching the vehicle, as your firefighters are approaching the vehicle. It's not going to be a rapid explosion. The fire slowly starts and goes from there. However, there is a possibility for fire to quickly start creeping up on you and not to even know that it's there. Toxic fumes, from the off-gassing of the batteries. Once the batteries have been ruptured, there's a possibility for fumes there, depending on if you're using fresh water or salt water to extinguish it, or even in a flood type scenario, if it's in salt water. There's a possibility for those fumes to be extremely toxic based upon a chemical reaction. Lithium burns, as you saw in some of the videos, those batteries are able to start shooting off into different directions. Just be cautious that there is that potential. Toxic runaway. runoff. You know, as you're starting to flow and you're starting to get the acids off of the cars, the different chemicals that are coming from these batteries, you want to make sure that your apparatus, your hose lines, your personnel are all uphill and upwind and away from where the contaminants are going. You also, if it's going into stormwater drain systems, if at all possible, you want to contain that runoff so that it's not causing a pollutant to the area. And reignition for up to 24 hours after initial extinguishment. We've actually seen it even longer after that. Be cautious that when the vehicle is moved, there is a high probability that if it was on fire, it is going to catch fire again. For the law enforcement side, this is a vehicular homicide type incident or something requiring investigation of the vehicle. You may want to perform your investigation sooner than later. Sometimes the longer you wait, the evidence may all be burned up by the time you get to it. For the fire departments, you may want have your truck follow the vehicle to the tow yard because there is a possibility that it will reignite multiple times going down the road on the flatbed trailer. We've actually had them going down the road, and as they've hit bumps along the way, that those vehicles have reignited and we've had to extinguish them on the trailers. Once they get to a tow yard, isolate them from the other vehicles. The last thing you want to do is to have an entire tow yard going up in flames in the middle of the night from one of these vehicles. Know that it's a high hazard vehicle, that there is a possibility for it to reignite, and isolate it from all the other vehicles that are out there. These are some of the things that I just kind of mentioned as we went through. You know, securing a large, continuous, and sustainable water supply, making sure you have the hose line in place, and most importantly, as I put down there in red on the right-hand side, is if possible, follow the record of the storage area and make sure that it's at least 50 feet away from other vehicles. One of the other things that we did see, which Barth had mentioned, was after Hurricane Ian over in Fort Myers, we were starting to see some electric vehicles catch on fire. We provided communication to the community to get their vehicles away from their homes. If they had a tow company and the vehicle was in the garage and it had sustained substantial flooding damage, to get it out of the garage, get it away from the home, and get it down towards the street, where if it did catch fire, it wasn't going to engulf their entire home and lose everything that they had potentially just lost in a hurricane. So trying to make that as minimal as possible. As Dr. Barth had mentioned, there's many of different solutions that are out there right now and being tried across the world. The bottom left-hand screen that you see is something that's out of Europe right now, and it's a container that they're actually picking the vehicles up and placing them in that container of water, completely isolating them. The top left corner is something that's here in the United States. It's like a dam and dike type system. Some municipalities are utilizing that, placing that around the cars and filling it up with water to completely isolate it. The top right corner is something that you're seeing more over in Europe. It's like a fire blanket, just breaking the fire triangle and eliminating the oxygen source, which then eliminates the fire. And then finally, down on the right-hand side, you're seeing something that's starting to show up here in the United States. And it's a nozzle that's designed for EVs. Basically a fog nozzle that is attached to an 1.5 inch line, slid up underneath the vehicle and able to actively cool it. Here in Fort Lauderdale, we're not utilizing any of those. We're utilizing your good old fog nozzle. We take an 1.5 inch line, we place it on a fog, we open the nozzle up and we shove it underneath the vehicle. We're using that in a combination of a wetting agent. We here in Fort Lauderdale use Fire Aid. It breaks down the molecules of the water, giving a much better cooling effect and able to penetrate better as well. We found that Class A foams or AFFF foams, although they provide an encapsulating concept to the fire, they really don't do well with penetrating it and cooling it down. So we've seen that this wetting agent does a whole lot better. And finally, information is key. Knowledge is key. You know, their NFPA has a lot of information out there. If you look in the bottom part of this picture, you'll see there's a QR code on this gas cap. all Mercedes-Benz have a QR code. It's located on the gas cap and also on the driver's pillar. If you were able to access either of those, you can scan that on any device connected to the internet, and it'll give you all the information about that car. It'll give you all the cutting points, where the hazards are located, where the batteries are located, and help you through that. Another app that we're using here that's been very beneficial is the Top app. It's called EV Rescue. It's available for free on the App Store, and you can download it to your phone, your iPad, any of that. And you'll see through there, it's point and click. You go through and it has passenger cars, the type of cars, type of vehicles, buses, all of that sort of stuff. And it'll then walk you through, giving you the cut, no cut points, where the high voltage lines are running, how to disconnect those, and the key factors that you need. So as I mentioned, this is a topic that we could spend hours per vehicle manufacturer on. We could really spend an entire week going over electric vehicles and more so lithium batteries, and how we're starting to see those fires not only in cars, but in boats, and we're seeing them in scooters, inside homes, and we're seeing across the board. So take the time now, take the time to educate yourself, educate your crews, educate your officers of the hazards that are potentially here. And by doing so, our goal is that everyone will go home safe. So I know we're at the very end of our hour here. I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to turn it back over to Jim, and thank you to everyone. Please stay safe out there, be vigilant, and hope to see you again.